Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep today into a book that explores the lives of children who grew up in the shadow of Nazi Germany and Austria. The book is called Born Guilty: Children of Nazi Families. And it's a collection of interviews by Peter Sakrovsky. And he spoke with the children of Nazi officials and perpetrators
Yeah.
in post-war Germany and Austria, uncovering how they dealt with the weight of their parents' past.
Yeah, what's so impactful about this book is it doesn't offer easy answers.
Yeah.
It really reveals that raw spectrum of emotions,
Yeah.
the internal struggles, and the deeply personal ways that these individuals grappled with their family history.
Wow, it sounds incredibly complex. Did these children react in a similar way, or were there lots of different responses to what their parents had done?
You know, it's interesting. The range of reactions is fascinating. Some individuals expressed pride in their parents, and they actually found ways to justify Nazi ideology, while others were consumed by profound guilt and shame, desperate to distance themselves. Like, imagine growing up with that burden, trying to reconcile the love for your family with the horrific acts they committed.
Yeah, I mean, the book uses actual interviews to illustrate these diverse reactions, right?
Exactly. Take Stephanie, for example. She expresses this intense pride in her grandfather, a high-ranking Nazi official who was executed for war crimes. He remained a hero in her eyes. Yet her sister, Brigitte, chose a completely different path. She dedicated her life to atonement, struggling to understand her father's actions, and working to make amends for the family's past.
Wow, that's quite a contrast. I mean, they shared the same family history, but their realities were completely different.
Yeah, and that's a key insight from the book. Many families were fractured by the weight of the past. Some children, like Anna, coped by staying silent, burying the truth deep down, never discussing it, even during regular Sunday visits with their parents.
Yeah, I mean, that had to take a toll on her relationship with her parents. Did it create that kind of distance in other families too?
Absolutely. This silence often led to intense intergenerational conflict and alienation within families. In Anna's case, her mother had even trained her to say nothing when questioned about her father's trial. They lived in this bubble of denial, which ultimately led to Anna's emotional detachment.
I mean, denial seems like it would be a common coping mechanism in these circumstances.
It was, but it often hindered any real healing or understanding. While some, like Anna, relied on silence, others went further, attempting to justify their parents' actions. Some even rebelled, embracing opposing ideologies as a way to break free from their family legacy.
Yeah, the outline mentioned two siblings, Rainer and Brigitte, who had very different ways of dealing with the past. Did that difference create conflict between them?
Definitely. Rainer became a fierce left-wing activist, fighting against everything the Nazi regime stood for, trying to prevent history from repeating itself. But Brigitte took a more pragmatic approach, accepting the past without condoning it, and focusing on building a future for herself. Their contrasting approaches, though understandable, caused a lot of friction.
Makes sense. It really highlights how these coping mechanisms weren't just personal, they had ripple effects throughout entire families. So we've seen reactions ranging from pride to guilt, silence to rebellion. Was there a common thread among all these children of Nazi perpetrator?
Yes, many of them shared this struggle for identity. They wanted to forge a new path for Germany, to be part of a new Germany, but the inescapable legacy of their parents' past held them back. Some, like Monica, faced internal conflict. She became a psychologist, trained to see the good in everyone. But how do you reconcile that training with the undeniable evidence of your father's horrific actions as an SS officer?
That's such a difficult position to be in. How did Monica and others deal with that conflict?
It varied. Some tried to bridge the divide. Ingeborg, for example, married a Jewish man, embracing his cultural traditions and trying to create understanding between their families. But it alienated her from both sides and created a sense of displacement. Others, like Egon, admired their Nazi parents, while acknowledging flaws in how Nazism was executed.
It sounds like a constant internal battle.
It was. And alongside this struggle for identity, there was another pervasive theme: silence. Many parents refused to confront the past, creating this cycle of guilt and trauma for their children.
It seems like if the parents couldn't face the truth, their children would have a difficult time healing.
You're right. The book gives some chilling examples of how deeply ingrained this silence and denial were. Rudolf's father casually reminisced about the terrible experience of executing children during Project Reinhard, the Nazi plan to systematically murder Jews in occupied Poland. There's a disturbing lack of remorse in his words. Then there's Sibyl's mother, who couldn't comprehend how a respected doctor like Viktor Frankl could have been an Auschwitz inmate. Her prejudice was so deep, she couldn't grasp reality.
That's truly horrifying. Did the book find that everyone had moved on from Nazi ideologies after the war?
Unfortunately not. While some grappled with guilt and shame, there were individuals who held on to those ideologies, showing how deeply ingrained they were.
It's unsettling that those beliefs persisted even after the horrors of the war were revealed. Did those persistent ideologies have any noticeable impacts?
They certainly made it more difficult to confront this dark chapter of history. Remember Anna's mother's instruction to say nothing. That showcases the ingrained culture of secrecy and self-preservation. This denial wasn't just individual, it was systemic, making it harder for future generations to process the truth and heal.
So this wasn't just about remembering historical facts. It was about grappling with the beliefs that made those atrocities possible.
Absolutely, and the book shows how those beliefs, those ideologies, continued to impact the children of those who held them.
Okay, that's a lot to take in.
Yes, it is, and we've only scratched the surface. Born Guilty goes even deeper, exploring how this legacy of silence and denial impacted the lives of these children in very specific ways.
It sounds like there's a lot more to uncover. I'm eager to hear more about the individual stories and what they reveal about the lasting consequences of this historical trauma.
Let's dive into that next. There's a lot to unpack about how these individuals tried to navigate their lives with the weight of their parents' past on their shoulders.
So we've talked about the range of reactions and coping mechanisms. What were some of the specific ways these individuals tried to manage the weight of their parents' pasts?
Well, their stories highlight how this historical baggage really impacted their lives. For some, it manifested in a need to rebel, almost as if they were trying to outrun their pasts. Johann, for instance, became a petty criminal.
What drove him to a life of crime?
Well, his father lived in constant fear, desperately trying to erase his Nazi history. And Johannes reacted by kind of embracing a life on the wrong side of the law. It was almost a twisted form of rebellion, like he was trying to embody his father's guilt, but in a different way.
So instead of atoning for his father's crimes, he acted out in this destructive manner.
In a way, yes. He was drawn to this idea of the undetected crime, always pushing the boundaries. It gave him a sense of control in a world where his family history made him feel powerless.
That makes sense. It seems like a lot of these individuals were struggling with this sense of powerlessness.
Absolutely. They were trying to find their place in a world that was still grappling with the consequences of their parents' actions. Some, like Gerhard, chose to rewrite history altogether. He insisted that his father, a former Nazi mayor, was completely innocent, a victim of circumstance.
That's interesting. Did Gerhard benefit from his father's position, despite believing he was unjustly accused?
Yes. In fact, he used his father's connections to get a cheaper house. He clung to this narrative that they were the real victims, even while reaping the benefits of his father's past.
Sounds like a classic case of denial. Did this rewriting of history show up in other stories?
It did, and it speaks to this broader theme of how some children of Nazi perpetrators attempted to control the narrative, to paint their parents in a more favorable light. This distortion of history prevents honest conversations about the past. It makes it harder to learn from the mistakes that were made.
So this denial wasn't just a personal coping mechanism. It had broader implications for how society dealt with the past. Were there other ways this family history manifested in their lives?
Certainly. Take Sibylle, for instance. Her father was in the Waffen-SS, and she grew up terrified of inheriting his coldness and capacity for manipulation. She described feeling housebroken by her parents, her spirit crushed by their criticism and attempts to control her.
That's heartbreaking. How did she cope with this fear?
Well, she developed this obsession with order and control, as if trying to create a sense of stability in a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable. It shows how the trauma of the past can manifest in unexpected ways. Her fear wasn't just about her father. It was about inheriting the potential for evil that she saw in him.
And it seems like her parents' silence and denial would have amplified those fears. Did anyone manage to break free from that cycle and find their own path?
Yes, there were stories of hope and resilience. Remember Ingeborg, who married a Jewish man? She actively sought reconciliation, embracing his culture and challenging her father's deep-seated anti-Semitism.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier. It was such a powerful act of defiance. But it also came at a personal cost, right? She faced alienation from both her family and her husband's family.
Exactly. Her story highlights that breaking free from the past is a journey, not a destination. It takes immense courage and a willingness to challenge deeply held beliefs. And it doesn't always have a happy ending. While Ingeborg ultimately found peace with her husband and children, there was still a sense of loss for the home and family she left behind.
It's a reminder that reconciliation is a complex process, both individually and for society as a whole. Did the book find any examples of children of Nazi perpetrators who embraced aspects of their parents' beliefs?
There were some unsettling stories along those lines. Egon, for instance, admired his father, a doctor who conducted experiments on prisoners in the SS. He acknowledged that some Nazi ideas were flawed, but insisted the core principles were sound. He saw his father as a political animal driven by conviction rather than a thirst for cruelty.
He was trying to separate the man from the ideology.
Exactly. He argued his father wasn't inherently evil, just misguided. This line of reasoning minimizes the horrors of Nazism and perpetuates this myth of the good German simply following orders. It raises serious questions about whether history could repeat itself if these ideologies persist.
Especially since Egon saw himself following in his father's footsteps. He wanted to be a doctor and viewed medical training as a path to power and influence, just like his father. That's a disturbing thought. Did other interviewees express similar sentiments?
There were others who grappled with the possibility of inheriting their parents' darkness. Stefan, whose father was also an SS officer, is a good example. He felt like a victim of his father's brutality, even though he hadn't experienced the same atrocities.
That seems like a very different experience from the other children we've discussed.
It is, but it speaks to the deep psychological scars left by a traumatic past. Stefan saw parallels between his suffering and the suffering of the Jews, arguing they were both persecuted. This distorted view of history highlights how trauma can be passed down through generations, shaping an individual's worldview in profound ways.
His experience raises questions about victimhood and how we define it in the context of such a complex historical event. Were there any stories that offered a more optimistic outlook?
Yes, definitely. Werner's story is a powerful example of transcending a toxic upbringing. His father was an SS officer, but he rejected his family's ideology thanks to his communist grandfather, who instilled in him a sense of social justice and a critical perspective on history.
It sounds like his grandfather played a crucial role in shaping his worldview. Did Werner reject his father completely?
He didn't shy away from the horrors of his father's past, but he chose to define himself by different values: empathy, compassion, and a commitment to social justice. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the power of education to break down barriers.
His story is very inspiring. It shows that even when faced with the darkest aspects of humanity, there's still a possibility for growth and change. Did the book draw any conclusions about the potential for future generations to learn from these experiences?
In the postscript, Sikorski shares letters and feedback he received after the book was published, and they highlight a fascinating generational shift. Younger Germans and Austrians seem more willing to confront the past and learn from it, unlike some of the older interviewees who remain stuck in denial or justification.
That's encouraging. Did this younger generation offer any specific insights?
There was a letter from a teacher who expressed guilt that Nazi ideology was still so prevalent, even after 40 years. It shows an awareness of the past's ongoing impact and the need for continued vigilance against hatred and prejudice. The younger generation also seemed more aware of the potential for atrocities to happen again. They weren't naive enough to believe that the horrors of the Nazi era were a thing of the past.
That's a sobering thought. But it's also a call to action. They're acknowledging the responsibility they inherit to fight against injustice and promote tolerance.
Exactly. They understand that the past isn't really past, it shapes the present.
Yeah.
And it's up to them to create a different future.
It's a powerful message and a good reminder for us all to reflect on our roles in shaping a more just and compassionate world.
This deep dive into Born Guilty has certainly been heavy, but it has illuminated the enduring impact of trauma, the complexities of guilt and responsibility, and the ongoing struggle to confront the darkest chapters of human history.
It's a lot to consider. Yeah, it really feels like this book is urging us to look inward and consider how the past shapes our present.
You're right, it prompts us to consider the potential for darkness, not just in history, but within ourselves as well. It's a call to be vigilant against the forces that lead to hatred and violence, and to be aware of our own biases.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you say that, because it seems like the author Sikorski was trying to emphasize those ideas by highlighting the younger generation's reactions in the postscript.
Yes, there's a clear generational shift in perspective. Younger people are less likely to identify as victims or perpetrators. They're more interested in understanding history's complexities and recognizing the responsibility that comes with inheriting this traumatic past.
It's almost like they're breaking free from that cycle of silence and denial that we talked about.
Exactly. They're more open to dialogue and willing to acknowledge the ongoing impact of the past. That letter from the teacher who felt guilty that Nazi ideology was still widespread really stood out to me. It's a powerful statement about the need for continuous vigilance against hatred and prejudice.
Yeah, and he wasn't alone in that sentiment, right? Sikrovsky mentioned that many younger people recognize the potential for history to repeat itself.
That's a crucial point. They've grown up with the understanding that even in seemingly civilized societies, the seeds of hatred and violence can take root. They've learned that complacency can be dangerous, and that we must actively combat injustice and intolerance.
It's a sobering reminder, but also a call to action. We can't afford to be passive bystanders. We must be actively involved in shaping a better future.
That's the core message of this book. It's a call for awareness, responsibility, and action. The fight against hatred and prejudice is never-ending, and each generation has a role to play in ensuring that the mistakes of the past aren't repeated.
This deep dive into Born Guilty has been incredibly insightful. It's given us a lot to think about, especially the lasting impact of trauma, the complex nature of guilt and responsibility, and the ongoing struggle to confront these dark chapters in human history.
Yeah, and the book doesn't offer easy answers or simple solutions, but it provides a framework for reflection, empathy, and deeper understanding of the human condition.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Born Guilty, we leave you with this. As you reflect on these stories, consider what resonated most with you, what challenged your assumptions, and what inspires you to take action. The past may be behind us, but it's up to each of us to shape the future we want to see. Until next time, remember, knowledge is power, and using it wisely is our collective responsibility. Thanks for joining us.